Hello, and welcome back to Dr. Hollowed. Today we'll be delving into some real-life stories from the people who are still haunted by having lived through them. So if you're ready for some goosebumps, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button.
I was at one of my friend's houses, and two other friends and I were laying on the floor in the dark watching Netflix on a laptop. There was a light coming from the bathroom behind us on the other side of the house, so it made a slight glare on the laptop screen, and I thought I saw something move in the reflection. So I looked closer and saw what looked like a very small person walking up behind us. It stopped, then it just stared. So I turned around, and there was nothing there at all. I never even heard a noise either, and the floors in that house were very creaky, so you could always hear if someone was walking around. That really freaked me out. I had a hell of a time trying to sleep that night because when I tried to lay down and sleep, I kept seeing black shadows pass by her door. That was the only night that ever happened. I slept over several times after that, and not once did anything like that ever happen again. Mom's story, not mine. Back in the summer of 2008, it was late afternoon, and my dad had some friends over. My dad was in the backyard with all of his friends, sitting around and drinking. My mom was in the kitchen making ceviche. The way our kitchen was set up was that if you were standing at the kitchen island working on something and looked directly ahead, there would be a window where you could see the front porch or front yard. My mom claims that while she was making the ceviche for my dad and company, she apparently saw me and my little brother running around, jumping from the rails of the porch. She told us to knock it off and continued her work. It happened again, but I decided to just let us be. Once my mom was finished, she went into the backyard with the tray of food, where she saw my little brother sitting next to my dad on the ground, playing with some trucks. She told my dad to keep an eye on him because he could get hurt if he continued to jump around. My dad and all his friends looked confused and said that my brother hadn't once left his spot for over an hour. She went inside and started yelling my name, looking for me. This is what I remember. I woke up from my nap and went downstairs, asking what she wanted. She started asking me about what I had been doing. If I had been outside playing, etc. I answered everything and just ended up going back to bed. My mom wasn't too afraid, as it definitely wasn't the first time she had experienced something unexplainable. When I was in middle school, I lived in an apartment building on a 6-lane road in Los Angeles and had to cross several major intersections to walk to and from school. One of my friends lived near me but was halfway between intersections, so we used to jaywalk across the street to her house and hang out for a bit after school. One morning, before I went to school, Mom made me promise not to jaywalk because she'd seen some other kids from my school do it the day before and knew it was really dangerous and stupid, especially with the traffic in that area. On the way home from school, my friend started jaywalking, and I grabbed her shoulder, pulled her back onto the curb, and told her that I had promised my mom not to jaywalk. Not more than a second after I do that, we hear a car skidding. It had apparently swerved to avoid a bicyclist. We watched as it got hit head-on by a car in oncoming traffic, flipping in kind of a cool movie way, and the driver was decapitated. All exactly where we would have been crossing the street. I grew up in South Texas and was out camping with my Boy Scout troop at a place called Bear Creek Scout Reservation. One night we decided to play capture the flag in the woods. Anyway, I was one of the older kids, about 16 or so, and I was running around by myself, trying to sneak to the other team's base, when I came into a clearing. Someone else walked into the clearing from the other side, and we both stopped as we saw each other. We were probably about 40 feet from each other. I wasn't sure if he was on my team or not, so I took a few cautious steps towards him. There was enough moonlight out that I could see where I was going, but not enough to make out who the guy was. He was tall and thin, and his arms seemed a little too long. I thought it must be this older kid named Dax because he kind of had a build like that, but I couldn't really see, so I asked who he was. The guy didn't say anything. He just stood there, looking at me. I stopped in my tracks. That's when I noticed his face was all bright white, almost like he had painted it or maybe had a mask on. It freaked me out, but I figured one of the other older scouts was maybe trying to look scary to mess with the younger kids. Funny, I said. Seriously, who is that? But still no reply, he just stood there looking at me, not moving. I started to get scared, so I took a few steps backward and then turned and ran as fast as I could. I met up with some of my friends again, and before long, I had forgotten about that guy in the woods. I didn't think about him again until the next day, when we were packing up and assembling as a troop. Looking around, I realized there was no one there who fit the body shape of the guy in the woods with the white face. No one is even close. I had forgotten, but that kid I thought it was actually wasn't even there camping with us that weekend. I have no idea who it could have been. I just knew he wasn't from my troop. It's possible he was from another scout troop, and that's what I told myself. But if there was another troop there at the camp at the same time, we never saw them. I managed a few stores locally, and the last one was definitely haunted. First, the building is old as hell. Second, a huge graveyard was across from it, and third, it was built on a reclaimed part of the graveyard. The store is located on a small strip of 5 shops. We were on the far left end but are now on the far right after remodeling a new location. Anyways, our ghosts were morning and really late night people. 3 a.m. to 9 a.m. I'll just give a quick list of a few things that happened. Opened one day with one driver. We were talking about ghosts when we both saw a man walk through the back of the store. We look at each other and ask each other, "Defuke? Look." So we walk to the back, and again, both of us close the bathroom door. So we both walk there, and I knock, saying, "Sir? I don't know how you got back here, but would you kindly ask if you needed to use the restroom?" You scared the heck out of us. Important note, there is only one way in the store, so we knew it couldn't be a person. We were by the door. I didn't get a response, so I tried to open the door, but it was locked. I try and bust it open, not budging. I was away for the key, and my driver points behind me. I turn to see the door just open a hair. This door is on a weighted hinge, so that shouldn't be possible without force being applied. Another time I was alone in the store at 3 because money was short and I was responsible for that if I couldn't find it. Sure enough, I hear a snap of a hinge and slow footsteps. I left the money and walked out of there. I locked the office since I opened the next day and worried about that later that morning. Again, recently in that new store, on video, we have brooms falling off racks. Trust me, they didn't slip. The door for opening and closing completely shut, and 2 nights ago the manager closed up, walked out to his car, and watched the light in the office cut back on. Store I first worked at, it's same as the second story. Every day you opened, you heard footsteps. The back 2 doors that were across from each other wouldn't always open, but you saw them close. I don't even know how to explain that one, but even the current managers will swear by it. The feeling in that style is that if you are alone, you feel as if you are in a horror movie right before the bad shit happens. Just gonna wait for the jump scare. And those are just a few of them, definitely not all. I try to collect stories like this through life. I'm somewhat agnostic myself, so this helps me cope with the uncertainty of things and hope for something more. Maybe this will help others out there in the same spot. Thank you all for your own experiences. When I was still unborn, my father was on a business trip and, as he tells it, was in a hotel sleeping. He had a dream that night that scared him afterwards so much that he called my mother and told her to stay at their house. In the dream, he was floating through another hotel, unlike the one he was in when the building began to shake and collapse. People were screaming and trying to get out of the building, and he saw some people smashed under the rubble. I woke up that morning, made the call to my mom, and about an hour later, there was emergency news on TV about an earthquake in a city about 100 miles away and a hotel building that partially collapsed and killed a good number of guests. So, still shaken up, he goes to visit his father a few days later, and he wants to tell him about his dream experience. My grandfather shares his own version of a similar dream that same night, but in the dream itself, he also sees his dead wife, my grandmother, in the rubble calling out to him. Details in both dreams are fairly similar, the floating and the shaken feeling afterwards. What's interesting as well is that both my father and grandfather aren't spiritual, seeking spirituality, or even different kinds of guys. My grandpa was an old school farmer from the 20s, and my father was a straight-laced military guy born in the 40s. Fast forward to my own experience. I never had a dream like either of them had described until I was about 19. I was sleeping alone one night while at college and had a dream that felt like anything I'd ever had before or after. The best way I can describe it is uncomfort, unease, maybe some fear. When I woke, I was shaking and dripping with sweat. The dream itself was in black and white. I was riding as a passenger with a kid from my high school that I didn't know all that well. We were driving down back roads through lots of woods from my hometown, just woods and woods, making turns and more turns. Eventually we made a turn, and the first thing I saw was a farm with a silo next to it ablaze, lighting the sky orange with fire. I turned to the kid in the dream as he drove past it, now with the burning silo behind us, asking him what it meant. His response was, "I don't know." That's the point when I wake up. I'm still fucking shaking after the dream. It felt different from any dream I've ever had. Dad picks me up to drive me home that day for winter break, and I ask him, kind of sheepishly, as it was silly, if there had been a farmhouse that burned down recently in our hometown. "No, why?" I said nothing, it was silly, just curious. A week passes, and I'm on my way to return to college, and my mom is driving me back. She casually asks me during conversation if I had heard the news about the farm silo that burned down in the town adjacent to ours. Apparently, 2 kids were playing with fire in the silo hay when it caught fire and killed the 2 of them in it. I have always been half tempted to go back and see the location to see if it matched the image in my dream, though it has scared me shitless since. I've never had a dream again that produced the same feeling. The wife's uncle swears up and down that he was at his home in Connecticut when he saw something like a will-o'-the-wisp float out of his room, passing through the walls, down the steps, into the kitchen cabinet, and then up and out through their child's room. His wife and daughter also apparently, though I never verified with them, saw the event. Kind of an ethereal orb that floated through the walls and furniture. The girl I met with recently had a friend who was in a car accident one morning. A lifetime friend she was really close with, from what she said, had a dream the night of the accident of seeing him dead in a car wreck. That morning, someone came to tell her the news, and she stopped them, saying that her friend had died in a car wreck, hadn't he? There were no prompts or news beforehand, she just knew. My mother was married to a man before she met my father. The guy was fairly wild, always out on the town at night. From what she said, as he approached his mid-20s, for a few weeks he began to have horrific nightmares of dying in a car crash. He would wake up with panic attacks, saying that he was trapped under the car, it was on top of him. The night he died, before going out, he told my mom he felt the universe was done with him. And apparently it was, he died that night in a car crash. My mom had to ID him. She told me about 3 years ago that when the policeman took her in, she was afraid to look. She was certain it would be on top of him like he had dreamed, though apparently he was tossed from the wreckage, so he wasn't underneath it. Recent experience, less creepy, though still of importance to myself. I had dated a woman years ago who was the first love of my life until we broke up due to a long-distance relationship. She was about 300 miles away. 10 years pass, and she reaches out to me after finding my number online. Still has feelings and wants to talk and meet, though at this point I'm happily married and have a family. Though our relationship ended suddenly, I never had a chance to have closure. 1 week after she calls, suddenly I'm handed this out of the blue trip, directly to her city in that specific state, on my own, with no one for a few days.
A. I never travel. B. It's literally 1 week after she calls, and C. I'm also alone.
It's as if something were just setting it up, saying, hey, here's a test, also look up synchronicity if you've never done so. It's kind of a good example of the situation. I went on the trip, and without contacting her while there, it gave me a strong sense of closure I never would have been able to get otherwise. My boss at a prior company told me that when she was a little girl, her grandmother passed away. Her mother would always tell her the story because, when she was like 4 or 5, she argued that she never passed. She was confused. Everyone was sad at the funeral, saying her grandma was gone, when she could see her plain as day right in front of her as the coffin went in. She upset a few people that day by arguing and was scolded for mentioning it, so she never talked about it much after. Though it was a big deal for her growing up. I was on a forum once a few years ago when a kid was talking about an experience he had in finding his biological father, whom he never met. The way he put it, his biological father left soon after he was born, and his mother never talked about who he was, his name, what he looked like, etc. The guy moves about 100 miles away to a town halfway through the state. One day, the kid happens to be in this town with a friend, shooting a BB gun at a lake. One shot ricochets up and hits a guy across the water. Apologetically, he runs over and talks with him. During conversations, it comes out that he was originally from his hometown. They share information, and he figures out that he is his long-lost father. Also interesting to note is that I found out my father had found the bones of a long-dead Indian woman out in the woods of Ohio when he was a teen. He scooped them up and kept them in a cigar box my entire life, splitting the bones with his friend at the time. The bones resided in the basement of our home, mainly because he didn't feel it was kind of him to leave her there alone for the animals. I never knew he even had them until this year, when he gifted them to my niece. I was 6 when a gold medallion my stepfather gave to my mom went missing. My mom and our nanny, Christine, looked everywhere for it for weeks and finally had to give up. They thought maybe my sister, who was a toddler at the time, must have hidden it. One day Christine's son shows up to return our car, which Christine had borrowed, puts my baby sister on his lap, and starts asking strange questions, like if we think he's a good person. He leaves after just a few minutes. An hour later, the police are at our house, and my mother is asked to come to the station to identify a body. It's Christine. Soon after, they ask to search our car. The trunk is full of blood. It turns out Christine had walked in on her son the night before while he had the gold medallion and a knife, cutting notches in it for a belt buckle. They quarreled, and he shot her point blank in the face, wrapped her in plastic, and then dumped her body on the side of the road. Then he drove to our house with the gun and the medallion in his front pocket, but whatever he was planning to do, he didn't. He wrote my mom letters from jail for 8 years. She had the medallion mounted on a gold chain and still wears it sometimes. I always forget this whole story until questions like this come up. My mom just called me and told me a story that happened to her today. She works as an RN in a psychiatric unit in a big city. She was in charge today and came onto the ward and noticed that someone was in the secure room. There had not been anyone in there when she left half an hour prior. She sees a nurse come out who is scared, and my mom proceeds to walk over to the room and look in the window. It is a woman in her late 20s or early 30s who has been on the ward for depression. What my mother witnesses is so out of the ordinary for this patient. The woman is screaming, "I'll fucking kill you. You don't know who I am. I'll fucking kill you," over and over. Her eyes are dilated, and she is absolutely hysterical. She ran up to the door, stared at my mother through the window, and began to froth at the mouth and scream. My mom said she felt like this woman was about to start twisting her head around like in The Grudge and thought she was possessed. She never said it. The woman then ran and started bashing her head against the wall and trying to strangle herself. My mom had to call a code white and have 6 men hold her down while they gave her medications. After that, she continued to scream, froth, fight, and bash her head into the walls. They had to secure her on a stretcher. When she started to come out of it, she was crying and shaking and saying, "I can't remember, I'm sorry." My mom went and talked to the psychologist who was called in to talk to her and asked him, what just happened? She had never seen this in her 20+ years of nursing. The psychologist looked at her and said, "What you just saw is stage 4 dissociation." Mom and the other nurses kind of laughed and said it looked like a possessed person. The psychologist looked at them and, with all seriousness, said, "In other parts of the world, people would call a priest and have an exorcism. And it would work," and then he left. Later on, Mom went to talk to her, and she said that this other woman who possesses her has been around for years. She only had episodes like this 3 or 4 times in her life. The woman would come and sit on the edge of the bed and talk to her, and the patient could sense her presence. Also, the parents of this patient said that they knew something was wrong since this patient was 6 years old. That freaked me out. My roommate had a bunch of night terrors and would sleepwalk a lot. I shared a room with him, and almost every night he would yell at the top of his lungs as if he were being murdered in his dreams. He would usually yell, "No, stop it," and jump out of bed after screaming for a while. Sometimes he would storm out of the room and still be asleep, sometimes speaking gibberish. A lot of times, it felt like he was talking to someone else that we couldn't see. Of course, being college students, we would mess with him at times as well. But the creepiest thing he ever said while he was in the middle of his night terrors, while it sounded like he was talking to someone, was, "No, I can't do that, they're asleep," while I was trying to sleep in the room. That scared the snot out of me. I knew right there that I should probably move out the next quarter. But I had always wondered why he had so many night terrors. He said his dad was a constant sleepwalker and told us this story once. When his mom was in Mexico, she and a bunch of relatives from his dad's side were all sleeping in a big living room after some sort of reunion. She was awakened by the sound of some sort of coin drop, and when that happened, everyone besides her stood up and walked in a circle for a few minutes until the same sound of a coin filled the room and everyone went back to sleep. I freaked the fuck out. This happened about 1.5 years ago and still confuses and creeps me out. It was a weekday morning in the middle of winter. I had just handed in my master's thesis a few days before that and finally decided to do all the cleaning I had been neglecting. So I decided to wash the floors room by room, and I moved a bunch of stuff in front of my door to let me wash all the floors. I plopped down on my couch, about 2 meters from my door, and start reading on my laptop while waiting for my floors to dry. Then I hear someone sticking their key into a lock, and I am so zoned out by it that I just assume it is my neighbor. However, the single most fucking creepy thing ever is watching your door handle turn from the corner of your eye and having someone push your door open. Thanks to me moving stuff for cleaning, he couldn't get it to open all the way. He then gave it a few more pushes and seemingly gave up. Then locked my door. I was completely terrified and shitting myself. It was so awful that I just felt completely powerless to do absolutely anything. Eventually I managed to finally call the police, but whoever he was long gone by the time they came. I still have no idea who they were. The guy who does all the condo management wasn't them, and there was no maintenance scheduled. They also said they would knock first. Since someone obviously had a copy of my door key and the condo front door key, they changed my locks and said they were going to change the front door locks. A week later, I am rushing to get ready to go out. Someone knocks on my door. Now people typically don't knock because we have a buzzer on the front door for all the apartments. I rush to throw on clothes since I just finished a shower, since I am assuming it is one of my neighbors coming to talk to me. I go and peer out to see someone I have never seen before in my life who is trying to turn my front door knob. At the same time I very loudly ask hello? The dude seems to freak out and mutters something about it being the wrong apartment. He then very quickly goes down the stairs, and I watch him get into his truck and take off. I called the police, and again they came, made a report, and talked to a few neighbors. The condo finally quickly replaced the front door lock, and it never happened again. I still, to this day, have no idea who or how that guy got a copy of my keys. I grew up on a small island off the coast of Florida. It was mostly farmland, nothing special. But the one thing that was great there was that in the summer, lychees would grow by the bagful everywhere. Lychees are little fruits with a hard outer shell, almost like hard grapes with a big seed in the middle. They are delicious. Anyway, when I was about 17, my friend and I would wait until about 2 a.m. and then drive our four-wheeler down to the lychee orchard, which was on a dirt road about a mile from any major roadway. We would ditch the four-wheeler and walk the last half mile, so we wouldn't make any noise. As usual, we would sneak onto the orchard, fill our backpack with lychees, and then head home and eat away. I had been doing this probably every summer from age 15 until about 19. But this time was different. As we were walking up to the tree that we usually pillage, we heard something beginning to move far in the distance behind the trees. My friend and I looked at each other but continued filling our backpacks anyway. I guess we thought if we ignored it, it would go away. But the rustling noises grew closer, and we started to get very nervous, and we began zipping our backpacks, ready to leave. It was here that the strangest thing happened. We began to hear a beating drum coming from all directions. The best way I can describe it is like the sound of the drums from the movie Jumanji. It started softly but then grew louder and louder. We began to walk away from the orchard. We didn't run, I'm not sure why. I guess we figured running would mean there was actually a threat that we didn't want to acknowledge, and the louder it grew, the faster we walked. Eventually, we were running. We made it back to the four-wheeler and drove home as fast as possible. The weird thing was that we didn't talk about it when we got home or eat the lychees. We just kind of sat in the room in shock. We decided it had to be some kind of security system, but when we researched, we couldn't find anything. I know this story is getting long, but I have to say that this wasn't the last time something happened at this orchard. A different friend of mine and I decided to try and steal some lychees again. By this time, I had gotten over the older event, pretty much just telling myself that it was a weird security system or an animal or something. So we did literally the same thing over and over again. I drove over, parked half a mile away, and walked to the same tree. After about 1 minute of getting there and grabbing some lychees, a completely white human figure begins moving in between the trees about 100 feet from us. I distinctly remember my friend whispering, "There is someone here, we need to leave." This time, we just ran full speed back to the four-wheeler. Once again, we got home safe, but the coincidences still trip me up to this day. My mom tells the story way better than me, but here goes. My mom used to have this weird recurring dream when she was a kid. She was a completely different person with a whole different family. Her twin sister and her parents were going out, but she wanted to stay home with the nanny and play with her toys. They suddenly heard banging on the front door. The nanny grabbed her, took her upstairs, and put her under her parents' bed. She said, "Stay under there, and no matter what, don't come out." She covered her ears and stayed quiet. She said she could suddenly feel somebody in the room, and then she felt somebody grab her feet and pull her out from under the bed. She always woke up then. This dream haunted her until she was 6, but it stopped after a while and she forgot about it. Then, when she was 23, she was working at a plant nursery. A coworker invited her out to meet a few friends of hers. One of the women was a bit older, in her 40s. My mom was talking to her, and the dream kept popping into her head, so she decided to tell her the story. The woman started crying and said, "That's the way my twin sister died." My mom was stunned, and they became very good friends. I was staying over at a friend's house, and we were upstairs when we heard weird noises from the backyard. We went down to the kitchen and got spooked because we realized the back door was unlocked. It was the middle of the night, and it was hard to see, so we opened the door to poke our heads out and saw a skunk. We figured it was rustling around the door, and we obviously weren't going to mess with it, so we shut the door and locked up. We went back upstairs for a while, then decided to go back down for something to eat. When we turned on the kitchen light, there was a man standing at the door with his face right in the window, staring into the kitchen. He looked horrible, sweaty and extremely red-eyed. We freaked out and fell over each other, trying to back away, when my friend realized that it was her brother. She opened the door to let him in, and he was pissed. He had snuck out to smoke, he was in high school too, and couldn't get back in after we had locked the door. He didn't want to pound on the door in fear of waking up his parents, who would smell the smoke on him. So he decided to wait at the door for one of us to come down and let him in. While he was waiting, he had a run-in with the skunk. Not exactly a creepy ending, but very scary at the time. I was watching my sister's house for a week while she and her husband went to Cape Cod for a week. She left me with her Rottweiler, who's a big baby and in no way a threat to invaders. Otherwise, this may have happened differently, because I still don't know what happened. I spent the entire day at her place, chilling in front of the TV. It was my day off work, so I just put on Netflix and watched endless streams of crap. Her house is 2 floors with a basement and attic, and I had periodically gone up and down the stairs to use the bathroom, change clothes, get snacks, and such. The important part is that I had passed under the ceiling hatch that led to the attic at least twice. Her attic entrance is one of those ones where you pull a cord and a ladder unfolds, and it's all creepy. The day passed normally. Until I went to bed in the guest room upstairs, the fucking attic hatch was open, and the ladder was unfolded. I took the dog and drove home immediately. I was not about to investigate that shit. I don't know who was scared more. Me, or my mom, who only heard someone, me, stomping around her house with a dog at 2 a.m. talking to my sister on the landline. The attic was still open when I went the next day with my friend, hell if I was going alone, and we closed it, but I still have no idea if maybe a draft opened it or what. I had asked my brother-in-law about it, and he just brushed it off. This is pretty weak, I know. I didn't see a ghost or anything or have a gypsy curse me. But when you know you have been alone all day and night in a safe place and then find something amiss, there are only 1 or 2 words to describe that feeling, and I don't know them. In the 4th grade, our school had a series of electives, basically, choose art or music, you could take, but a mandatory math class was required in addition to your primary math class. Our schools were pretty beat up and ramshackle, better than a rural school but far worse than a city school. Anyway, next to this math class was an overgrown courtyard that the students weren't allowed to go into. The only doorway into the courtyard was through the math room, and the only window next to the courtyard was in the math room. I was seated towards the front, 4 seats or so away from the window, and I'd always stare at it because, you know, math. One day, I saw a man in a yellow-orange shirt with a trash bag picking up debris and garbage from the courtyard outside. But the vegetation that he was moving through wasn't moving when he stepped on it, and he kind of looked like a reflection, so naturally, I turned to my right and looked around the room for a man picking up garbage in the room. Everyone was seated, and Mrs. W hadn't moved from the front of the chalkboard. I resumed watching this man. I was so fucking confused that I kept looking around for another window, a mirror, or something to help me rationalize this semi-transparent guy in our courtyard. I kept staring at this guy, and I tried raising my hand and asking, but I was shot down like this. Is your question math related? No, but. Then it can wait until after class. I turned back to look at him, and he started shuffling around and walking out of view. And after class, I look out the window, the overgrown grass and plants where he was standing are untouched. After class, I asked Mrs. W if someone was going to be cleaning up the courtyard, to which she said no. I'm not the best storyteller here, but the incident creeps me out to this day. I have no idea who he was. One night when I was about 19, I was having a dream, and oftentimes I know I am dreaming. This time I knew I was dreaming, and it must have been an uncomfortable dream, so I tried to wake myself up. I don't remember the dream, I remember what happened next. I was on my back, but I never sleep on my back. Then I couldn't open my eyes, so I tried to move my arms, but I couldn't move them either. I know of sleep paralysis. Then I felt that my mouth was open and my upper lip was scrunched up. My 2 front teeth started hurting like someone grabbed a hold of them with a pair of pliers and was trying to pull them out. I even heard creaking sounds. I struggle harder and harder to move my arms and to just wake up, and I feel my muscles straining. But the pain only worsens, and I finally think to myself, fuck it, don't fight it anymore, just let them take the teeth. Once I relax, the pain stops, and I can open my eyes and regain muscle control. Another time, when I was about 14, I had just gotten out of the shower. But this time I didn't follow my usual routine of drying off and getting dressed. For some reason I was so tired I just went and laid down on my bed. I remember I didn't even have enough energy to turn off my light, my hair was dripping wet, and I was laying on the edge of my bed in my wet towel when I fell asleep. Then suddenly, after some time, I can't recall how long, I woke up and there were 4 slender figures standing facing me. I couldn't see much because they were standing in front of my bedroom light, and as I woke up, they all turned their heads towards each other, and one was pointing at me but stopped, and then they just disappeared. I was so scared, and I became fully alert really quickly and couldn't fall back asleep. I do not believe in any type of spiritualism, psychics, the afterlife, or anything else along those lines, but there was one experience I cannot explain. When I was in graduate school, a friend of mine wanted to go see a somewhat famous psychic in town. This guy had been in the papers back in the mid-90s, and you had to get there at 5 a.m. to get in line to see him. He had a place in a shopping center, and you lined up outside until it opened and then took a number as you walked in. I tried to talk my friend out of it and tell him it was all a bunch of bull, but he was insistent, and given the guy's somewhat local celebrity status, I was curious to go and see how much of a faker he was. So we went, got in line, and waited. At about 9 a.m., I was finally called in. He was an older Asian guy sitting down on a rug, and he was shuffling playing cards without looking at them and sort of staring over my shoulder. He started muttering and at first said stuff that did not apply to me, but it didn't seem like he was talking to me. Finally, he sort of tilted his head and said that I was going to marry my girlfriend and that I should pray for my grandfather because his shoulder injury was going to be his death. He then said some banal stuff like I should respect my parents, not do drugs, and stop drinking as it was selfish and hurting my karma. He then said he was done, and I left. The amazing thing is that just a couple of days before the reading, my grandfather injured his shoulder, but I hadn't heard about it yet. A couple of months after the reading, my grandfather went into the hospital for a minor procedure on the shoulder and never came out. He developed a series of complications while there that eventually killed him. I was at a sleepover with a bunch of other kids at a friend's house. There were about 6 or 7 of us in total. The bedroom of the girl's house we were staying at was basically the entire attic space. It was a really old house in a shitty little almost ghost town in the middle of nowhere in Manitoba. When you entered the house, you came into a hallway with a few doors off on either side to the kitchen, bathroom, living room, etc. One of the doors opened to a staircase that went up. This was their attic bedroom. It was just an enclosed set of stairs all the way up, and at the top, there were 2 huge, open rooms with no actual door between them. Just a space for a door. We were up there all night playing cards and stuff when we heard footsteps on the stairs. We all thought it was the girl's older brother coming to spy on us, so we all quietly sneaked over to the stairs to see what was up. When we get there, we see the door at the bottom is still closed. You could see the light shining under the gap of the door from the hallway on the other side. We see no one on the stairs, which are fairly well lit. Well lit enough that there's no way a person could hide on them. As we all sat there and watched, some invisible thought clumped all the way up the stairs, stopping at what would have been the last one. It sounded seriously like a heavyset person in work boots was just stomping on up the stairs. Then it just stopped, and that was it. We never heard it again. Every single one of us was scared shitless for the rest of the night. We decided to call it quits and go to bed. I was supposed to sleep on the bottom bunk, and another girl was supposed to sleep on the top. The bunks were crap, though, and when she got up there, the whole bed just sagged until there was almost no room to move. So I just dragged the bottom mattress out and slept on the floor, while she stayed on the top bunk. In the morning, we decided to try and figure out where all the footsteps could have been coming from. Could it have been pipes rattling in the wall? We pulled the bed I'd been sleeping on away from the wall that was against the stairs to see it. It was covering an access hatch. The second we started pulling the bed away from the wall, the top bunk slammed into the bottom bunk, where I was supposed to have been sleeping all night. We barely touched that bed when we moved it, and it just collapsed. It was a huge, heavy frame someone had made by hand, and it would easily have crushed me if I'd been under it. All I could think of was how that girl had been on top, rolling around trying to get comfortable while I'd been under there, and yet at the slightest touch, it fell down. Many things happened to me, and my family, in the house I grew up in, and actually, other places as well. Some of these occurrences happened when I was young, and I know childhood memories aren't always accurate, but my family remembers this. I was sleeping downstairs in the living room on the couch, and I assume this is because I wanted to stay up late watching TV. I woke up to my back being hit. I was sleeping on my side, and though it didn't really hurt, it was uncomfortable. My brother's room was just down the hall, so I thought he was just messing with me. I remember saying, "Hey, brother, that's not funny," without opening my eyes. But I didn't hear anything, no footsteps or giggling, nothing. So I opened my eyes, got up and scanned the room, looked behind the couch, and I didn't see anyone. I was pretty scared while looking around because I thought my brother was going to jump out at me and scare me. Still, I checked my brother's room and the door was nearly all the way closed. He was fast asleep inside. I realized it was quite early in the morning and I was the only one awake. This was about 12 years ago, Sheesh. Anyways, I was living on the second floor of an apartment complex with my ex. The complex butted up to a golf course, which is relevant because we would get these awesome unobstructed winds blowing across the greens. This incident happened early evening. The sky was that beautiful color of azure blue, but it was quickly turning gray, perfect sleeping/napping weather. I had a bad cold, so I thought I'd help the healing process by catching some Z's. My girlfriend opted to stay up since it was still so early. She hopped on the desktop to play Dark Age of Camelot while I slid into bed. My bedroom was pretty big. It had enough room for my queen-sized bed and 2 rather large dressers with plenty of room to walk about. As I laid my head back on the pillow, my eyes blinked in slower succession until they felt so heavy I was all but helpless to stop their final shuddering. My ears were filled with that weird ambient quiet that seems to coexist with autumn nights. After a few moments, I found myself oddly soothed by the faint clicking of my girlfriend's fingers dancing across the keyboard in the other room. The clicks, the October winds, and my breathing all meshed into one, and I fell asleep. I surmise I had only been asleep for about 5 minutes when I awoke abruptly. My head felt stuffed, like a bad sinus infection. No big deal since I had a cold, but what was odd is that both my ears popped, painfully. Metallic sounding chimes filled my ears. The pitch rising quickly until it was no longer audible. Annoyed at the incident, I tried to reposition myself on the bed with the hopes I could resume my slumber. That's when I felt and then smelled a palpable musky, humid heaviness settle across my room. It was like I had stepped into the edge of a swamp on a hot sunny day. This oppressive wave spread quickly around the room. I struggle to describe how awful this was. The only word that suffices is woe. Like a viscous black tar, it snaked across the room, snuffing out what little light had been visible from behind my curtains. As incredulous as this all sounds, I wasn't alarmed. I was taking it all in like a passive observer, trying to process what was happening here. From my vantage point in the bed, the only things that should have been visible were my main dresser that had a huge mirror atop it. On one side of the piece sat a stack of boxes, my ex's unpacked clothes. On the other side was a purposely open space where the vent was located. As my eyes scanned the room, I saw a shadowy shape occupying the space in front of the vent. I thought perhaps my eyes were just fuzzy from what little sleep I had. I tried focusing my eyes with several rapid blinks, but this only resulted in bringing into focus what appeared to be a little girl about 10 years of age. She was hugging her knees and rocking back and forth slightly as if to comfort herself. Her clothes were soggy with mud and what looked like seaweed. Her skin was gray and sallow. Again, I wasn't afraid, I was merely processing. If this was a dream, I wanted to see where this went. Up until this point, she seemed unaware of my presence. As I stared at her intently, wondering who or what she was, her eyes locked on mine. She stopped rocking and shrieked. My ears popped again with that painful ringing, and before I could think what to do next, she leapt at me, her arms outstretched, hands poised like claws, ready to punish me for bearing witness to her sad state. I had no time to react. Her full weight fell upon me, causing the bed to creak loudly. I couldn't make sense of how heavy she felt. I tried to throw her off with no effect. Her fingernails were cutting into my skin while her bony fingers crushed my windpipe. The smell of rotting leaves and filthy water filled my nostrils. I was overwhelmed on every sensory level by this foul presence. I could feel myself quickly weakening as my attempts to fling her off failed. My strength was fading and I felt a mixture of sadness and anger. I didn't want to die this way. I started bargaining with a long silent God to save me. That's when I remembered my girlfriend was in the next room. I tried to scream, no time for manliness here, but I could barely breathe, let alone scream. Desperation was setting in. I felt with my entire being that I was going to be devoured in some way, and this would be a fate worse than death. So I tried a new tactic and shifted my body to the right in the hopes we would both fall off the bed. It worked. Also, it's not the freakiest, but I about had a heart attack, so it counts for me. I was on a scout camp in a foresty area and was tenting with one of my good buddies. I accidentally left the door open to the tent. Bugs had gotten in, but we hadn't noticed till late that night. We asked one of our scout leaders if we can sleep in his tent because we hate the hell out of bugs. Very manly and scout-like, I know. Anyways, he agrees and whips out his cot to sleep on under the pavilion. We get our shit moved in. Well, fuck, there's bugs everywhere in his tent too. We ask if we can sleep in his car. He lets us, so we got our stuff and set up in the car. Now he had a suburban type of car. A little bit smaller, though. Still 7-passenger type of thing. Our scoutmaster had left the back passenger side window open. My friend and I both decide to sleep on the very back seats. I wasn't able to sleep that night due to discomfort, so I was up the whole night. My friend was sitting on the driver's side, very back, and I was laying on the next 2 seats with my feet towards the passenger side. Now my head was under his blanket that he was using and my feet were out in the open. Sorry if this is hard to understand. Continuing, at some point in the night I hear footsteps outside. Fuck, I'm assuming it's a bear, but I did not want to move a muscle. The footsteps get louder and eventually stop. The next thing I hear is a sound that sounded soundy. A soundy sort of sound. It was like dog nails on tile. Except this time it was claws on a motherfucking car. The car slightly rocked back and forth. I remained perfectly still and basically stopped breathing. I could hear this motherfucker breathing. It was a heavy breathing. Slow. Inhale, exhale. Suddenly, with an exhale, my feet get super fucking warm. Nigga fuck the bear, I'm assuming, got down from the car with the same sound of the clicking claws, and I heard it slowly mosey its way back into the forest. I got zero sleep that night. The shitty part is, nobody fucking believed me in the morning. Fuck you, scout group. So here's something that happened to my family, and the reason we spent almost 10 grand on security. So where I live is 35 minutes drive from anything. This house is seriously in the middle of the woods. When I was 16 I had just started public school, and like most people I know, I was hungry after a long day, so I would usually make PB&Js. One day I came home and noticed that we were out of peanut butter, bread and jelly. That's odd was my immediate though, seeing as the day before we had over half a jar of each and more than 3/4 ths a loaf of bread. I asked my family and they hadn't used any. I shrugged it off and went on for a few weeks not thinking about it. So a Friday rolled around and I was super pumped for the weekend and no school. I get a ride with a friend home, family has gone to uncle's, and we walk in on a man with a long brown coat standing in our kitchen. We freak and run outside and call the cops and then my family. We're just sitting in the woods freaking out and we know it's going to take 30+ minutes for anyone to get here, and it's just me and my friend a good distance outside my house watching the entrances. Nothing happens. So the cops show up shortly before my family does and they go search the house and find nothing. Nothing but the peanut butter, jelly and bread laying out on the counter. My family decides that day to buy cameras and new locks. I didn't really rest easy after that and would wake up several times a night for no apparent reason. One particular night I woke up and was extremely thirsty, so I made my way downstairs to the kitchen to get a drink. I hit the bottom of the stairs and hear something fall in the kitchen. I didn't really get scared for some reason, I just kept walking to the kitchen. I peered around the corner and hit the light switch. The man in the brown coat spun around and looked at me. I will never forget his face. It was a sad, rough face, covered in hair, wrinkles and dirt. His eyes though, they were bluer than the sky. He started stuttering and saying, "I'm sorry." At this point I freaked and ran up the stairs yelling at the top of my lungs. My dad came running down with a bat and nearly knocked me down the stairs. When he got to the kitchen the man was already gone through the back door, floodlights were on. And there on the counter was peanut butter, bread and jelly. My dad reviewed the camera footage and found nothing, probably because they were outside cameras. A day or so later my dad was checking a part of our attic that we never used, kind of like a side attic. He found an old quilt with a pillow, several books, and strewn about were water bottles, food wrappers and old empty jars of peanut butter, jelly, preserves, etc. Now we have like 40,000 cameras around our house and locks that would make Fort Knox blush. Not really scary or whatnot, but still really weird. Nothing like this had ever happened to me before, or since, at least, not to this degree. I've lived by myself for the last 9 years. I'm currently 30. This happened in my last house. I woke up one night to the sound of footsteps passing my bedroom, going towards the kitchen. I wasn't exactly sure if I had really heard it, because after listening intently for a minute or two, there was no more sound. I looked at the glowing numbers of my alarm clock. It was 4:23 a.m. The footsteps were still echoing in my memory, far too vivid for my liking. So quiet as I could, and shaking with fear, I got out of bed and grabbed my vase's really lame weapon. Then I turned on my bedroom light and yanked open the door. Nobody. My house was actually just a really small open plan apartment, but there was a small hallway to the bathroom, and an empty bedroom. So I walked around the house, turning on all the lights, and checking the doors and windows and closets as I went. Nothing. I went back to sleep still a little weirded out. The next day I got to work, only to see that the office was dark. I work with only 3 other people, and I'm the second person scheduled to arrive. The boss wasn't there. As soon as I sat down at my desk, the phone rang. I knew it was the boss before I picked up. He sounded weird on the phone, stern and angry. He just said that he wouldn't be in that day. When I asked why, again with a weird feeling. This time that he had had intruders last night. His reply was that people had broken in. I didn't talk to him again until he came back a few days later. He said that 2 people had snuck in, he forgot to lock the back door, and stolen wallets and car keys plus his and his wife's cars. He woke up to footsteps about 4:30 a.m., and then chased them out. Okay, so not that creepy, but it definitely weirded me out. Annoying thing is that I can't really tell that story to anyone, because I seriously doubt they would believe it. February of 2012 I had this really weird dream. In the dream I was sitting in the living room of my apartment, on the futon, talking to what felt like one of my closest/oldest friends. We're talking and joking when abruptly, my body walks past us, wandering aimlessly around the apartment. I point at my own body, which is weird, and laugh. Look at it, it's lost without me. But I can still make it do whatever I want. Do you want a glass of milk? I then turn to my body, which is still wandering around near the door, and call to it, hey, go get us each a glass of milk. I then watch the back of my own body go to the kitchen, fetch glasses, pour 2 glasses of milk and then bring them to us, still sitting on the futon. As I turned to offer one of the glasses to my friend, I remember being blinded by light, and then everything went to fuzz. I woke up the next morning thinking, what the fuck? What a crazy dream. When I walked out of my room there were 2 full glasses of milk sitting in front of my futon. Growing up, I never had much contact with my paternal grandfather. He had been extremely physically abusive to my father and his siblings while they were growing up, so when they all moved out, they moved far away from him and didn't have much contact. As he and they got older, they kind of mended fences, and he planned a state-to-state visit to all of his 7 kids before he would be too old to visit them again. He came to stay with my family when I was around 12 or 13. I'd never met him before, but I was happy to finally meet my grandfather. He was a little gruff but told jokes and was interested in my schoolwork, etc. Now for the creepy part. We had a pretty large, 4-bedroom old house that was built in the 1920s. As all of the rooms were taken by me and my siblings and we didn't have a guest room, it was agreed that he'd sleep in my room and I'd camp by him in my sleeping bag on the floor. On what I believe was the 2nd or 3rd night, we went to bed pretty early. It takes me a while to go to sleep, so I just laid there and soon could hear his heavy snoring, which I had gotten used to. The room was really dark, but the door to the hallway was open, so a little light was able to get in. For some reason, as I lay on the floor, I looked up at his bed. I guess I was kind of soaking in the joy of being there with my grandfather after all those years of not knowing him. When I looked up at his bed, the most horrific thing I had ever seen in my life was looming over him. Coming out of his stomach was a black column of semi-solid smoke. It rose up from the floorboards, through the bed, through his body, and up into the ceiling. Then it arced back down from the ceiling, kind of like you'd see in those old pictures of sea serpents arcing through the water. It was very serpent-like and had somewhat of a face, but it was too smoky to really make out. Its face was just hovering about 6 inches from my grandfather's face. I sat up a little bit, but it just kept watching him. I decided to go get my parents, and that's when I noticed at my bedroom door about 6 feet away was another smoky thing. It was kind of triangle-shaped but jagged and had more visible jagged eye and mouth outlines. It was just watching me. I looked back up at the snake thing, and now it was watching me too. It said in an extremely authoritative and hateful voice, "You can't have him." The voice was booming and loud but barely made a sound at the same time. For some reason, without hesitation, I immediately said, "No, you cannot have him." The smoke looked surprised or something, I don't know how to explain it. I slightly recoiled and went back to watching my grandfather. I closed my eyes, and I was very sure this was something demonic, so I started praying by commanding it to go. I didn't do an exorcism or any nonsense, just the most heartfelt prayer a 12-year-old boy could muster up. I felt I was battling for his life with my words. I opened my eyes after about a minute or so, and it was gone, as was the thing by my door. I got up calmly and went to my parents' room, explained everything to my mom, and drew detailed pictures of what I saw. She said I could sleep with them that night, but I went back to my room and watched my grandfather all night. He was okay, and the rest of his visit was uneventful. I still remember that night like it was yesterday and always wonder what it was that I encountered. A few of my friends and I live close-ish to an abandoned slaughterhouse. We decided to check the place out and found it pretty empty aside from what we though thought to be cult-like dolls hanging from the roof of the den where the animals were stored. Creepy, yes, but we had seen that sort of thing before. We urban explore a lot. As we go back to the trail to get back to the car, we see blood on the gate leading out, and written in the blood it read, "We were watching you." Again, probably not even blood, but albeit creepy, probably just to mess with trespassers. We decide to go back at a later date. This was a few weeks ago. I have never been more afraid for my life than that night. We get to the factory and it is freshly vandalized, spectacular. We thought it looked amazing. So we took a picture. After we had taken it, I got a strange sensation of being watched. And I don't scare easy. I looked around and I could hear what sounded like unnatural swinging, like someone had bumped into something and caused it to swing. I backed my friends up and told them it was time to leave. My gut instinct was that something was wrong. We begin to leave and I turn around and watch our backs, our standard formation when leaving a dangerous area, mag light shining around, and I catch a glimpse of a man wearing a black beanie. He was standing in the window near the wall where we took the picture. I freak out for half a second and my buddy notices. I don't start running, but try to play it cool. We leave the area rather quickly, making way more noise than normal, and I begin to sprint and tell them to as well. The gate is rather rickety, so getting over is a trouble. We get a quarter mile away from the gate when I tell them what I say. Of course at first they didn't believe me. But then I motion towards the house and there is a light shining around. Someone was looking for us for sure. They being to sprint away, but I just watched to see where it went. It headed towards the gate and I followed after my buddies. First thought is a homeless person. This slaughterhouse is 1.5 miles away from a road. The road is 1 mile away from the nearest home and the neighborhood is rather deep off a main road in the city. No way in hell is there a homeless man living in an abandoned slaughterhouse 3 miles away from a store. My friends and I were on an amateur ghost hunting kick and were walking through the forest in town where the local KKK group used to meet in the past. We heard reports that they had tortured and murdered people in there, so we went in at midnight. We got about 100 yards in when we saw 2 glowing orbs high in the trees. They were flickering in unison and following us in the distance. When one of us asked the others if they noticed them, we all agreed they looked like eyes and froze in our tracks to watch them. After flickering in unison a few more moments, we started slowly backtracking to the exit of the forest, deciding we had enough. Not 10 steps later, the most sickening sounds of cracking and exploding trees filled the air behind us as we all broke into full sprints. The sound followed us like a train barreling through the trees. I remember diving out of the tree line and rolling a bit, I was moving so fast. We looked back with the rest of the group to see the red glowing orbs at the tree line at about eye level with us laying on the ground. Scariest fucking moment of my life. We went back the following day to see just how crazy we were and see if any trees had actually been splintered. Of course none had been. We walked further down the trail in the light and came across an old concrete bridge about 40 feet across by 20 feet wide, running horizontally across the path with a small drainage tunnel going through the middle. We crawled through this tunnel on our knees to find all kinds of satanic markings inside, like pentagrams. At the other end of the tunnel we found a small clearing with an old fire pit. Overall, everything we found didn't really prove our experience the night before, but it didn't exactly ease our thoughts either. I was at a mate's house spending the night when I was in middle school. As expected, we'd stay up to all hours, which didn't matter most of the time, except the bathroom was right near his parents' room. About the only time we'd get in trouble was when someone would wake them up when nature called. To avoid this, we'd go out the basement door and just pee in the woods. The door stayed unlocked most of the time because we'd managed to lock ourselves out more than once. This was also compounded by the fact that we'd all wander out and find something to do in the woods on a regular basis. This night his older brother was home and kept barging in the basement door and raining chaos from above, so we decided to lock the door just to deter him. Not that it really would have kept him out, but at least he'd have to use the key, and that took barging and fun out of it. About midnight we heard the handle jiggling and didn't think much of it, figuring it was his brother. After about 5 minutes of off and on handle fondling, my vocabulary has decided to not function at a high level today, we finally hit the door and yelled for him to stop. Quiet. No response, no more clattering of the handle. Great, we can move on, right? Well, about 10 minutes later it started again, and the process repeated. This went on for about 2 hours, until finally after telling him to stop we just said screw it and ignored it. He continued for about 30 minutes after our last attempt for him to stop and then just gave up. Well, fast forward to about 9 a.m., we were just stirring and one of my mates had to go to the bathroom. If you've ever had a sleepover like that, there are bodies strewn wherever there is space, and once the first person starts walking around it kind of stirs the nest. We all started stretching and making our way to relieve ourselves of all the soda we'd binged on the night before. As I go walk outside, I grabbed the door handle to close it behind me and noticed it felt rough. After looking at it, I saw that the space around the keyhole was all but destroyed. There were giant scratch marks on every surface and the metal guides were bent and skewed. I asked my friend that lived there what had happened, and he said it was the first he'd noticed it. Not really wanting to get blamed for something his brother did, we went upstairs and told his parents about the night before. After his dad went down to see what we were talking about, he went completely white and ran upstairs to call the cops. Evidently someone had been trying to force the lock open while we were all inside. That's actually happened to me more than once on different occasions. What completely freaks me out about this time was that this person knew we were in there and that we knew someone was trying to get in. Even so, he repeatedly tried to force his way inside. God knows what sort of person that was. Well, I'm late, but whatever. So about 2 years ago I was in my room reading a book when I hear it. Soft as ever, two little girls giggling. Not just any giggle. It was the kind of giggling you hear in horror movies. I immediately put down my book and listened. After about a minute of holding my breath, I decided it must have come from outside. Then that night, just as I'm about to drift off to sleep, I hear it again. Two little girls giggling. Now it was 2 a.m. and I was pretty damn sure there weren't two little girls outside my window at that time of night, so I began to freak out. I sat up in my bed and waited for what felt like forever just listening. Then I hear it again. I jumped out of my bed and go spend the rest of the night in the guest room. By the next morning I was convinced my room was haunted. For the next week I avoided my room and spent my nights in the guest room unbeknownst to my family. I was afraid to tell anyone for fear I was going crazy or they wouldn't believe me. But every time I spent more than an hour in my room I would hear those two little girls giggle. By the end of the week I was a mess. I could barely sleep and was terrified of my room. Then one morning my brother walks up to me and says, "You deaf or something?" Obviously I was confused, and after further questioning he tells me about this small device he had placed in my room. Apparently it's like some sort of prank device that's easily hidden and can make a variety of different noises. My brother, however, chose the creepy as fuck little girls giggling sound. He wondered why I hadn't heard it or said something about all week, and I just wanted to punch him in the face. So my room wasn't haunted after all. Moral of the story: sometimes your brother is just an asshole. I'm a female, first of all. I'm 21 now, but when I was 4 years old, my sister had just turned 16. She had just gotten her license and was so excited. It was probably only September, and she got her license in July. My sister is from my dad's first marriage, and she lived with her mom and stepdad while I lived with our dad and my mom. We lived about 30 minutes apart. My dad worked late hours, and my mom frequently traveled for work, so I had to spend a lot of time at babysitters, which was costly, until my sister got her license. My dad finally gave her permission to pick me up after she got out of school and take me to her mom's until he was off work. She was so excited to finally be able to use her license. I know I said I was only 4, but I remember this event so vividly. There are parts of it, understandably, that I've forgotten over the years. It took years for my sister to even ask me if I remembered it, but when I told her all the parts I remember, about 80%, she filled in the rest for me. It was one of the first times my sister would get to pick me up from my babysitter, which means it would be one of the first times she'd been allowed to drive with me alone. Almost as soon as we pulled onto the main road, a white pickup truck swerved behind us. Weird, but whatever. After a few turns, my sister noticed that the truck still followed her. Even when she would just switch lanes, he was right there switching behind her. My sister, being a bit of a paranoid person, tested it a little and switched lanes several times. She said she heard his tires squealing by his quick cuts to get behind her again. She told me not to worry, and I remember being an oblivious little kid. She looked scared, but I had no concerns. The man started to get really angry. I don't remember anything about what he looked like. I do remember that he had this look of pure hate on his face. Strange that you can sometimes remember expressions but not the faces they were on. He wasn't angry, he was full of hate. He was honking the horn repeatedly, just laying on it, and he was very close to our car. He was swerving back and forth, trying to get our attention. He would pull up beside us occasionally, flip us off, and honk. The first big event came about when we pulled up at a 4-way stoplight. It's a bigger one, so there was a lot of room in the intersection. We were the first ones at the stoplight in our lane, and nobody was beside us. The man used this lane to pass us, and pull his car in front of us almost in the intersection. He was blocking us. I so vividly remember that white pickup truck. He got out of it, and started storming towards our car. He was screaming so hard I remember thinking his face almost looked purple. Neither one of us remembers what he was saying, but he pulled up his shirt to reveal to us that he had a gun. He pointed to it and at us, threatening us, and closing the gap between us. My sister put her hand over my body, told me to close my eyes, and floored it through the intersection. She said she was worried we were either going to hit him, or get hit in the intersection, but it was a better chance than sitting there and waiting for the psycho with a gun. He hopped back into his car and followed us. My house was closer to where we were than my sister's, so for some reason, she decided to go to my empty house. Obviously, he followed us and blocked us into the driveway. He got out and walked towards my sister's parked car, pulling his gun out. Once again, She had to think fast and swerve her way across our lawn back out on the road. This is before cell phones, and she had just started driving and was still young. She had no idea what to do. He followed us back onto our neighborhood road, pulling up next to our car and hitting his truck against us, trying to make us skid or wreck. There is a smallish area of grass between my neighborhood road and a major busy road, and it was obvious he was trying to push our car hard enough to send us into the traffic beside us. He had his gun up on his dashboard still, all within reach. I remember him doing that little gesture where you drag your finger along your throat, like you're slitting it, like he was going to kill us. His face was still purple. There was a gas station nearby and my sister decided on the last thing she could think of. I remember her talking to me so seriously and sternly. She told me she needed me to be a big girl, and the second we pulled by the door of the gas station, to undo my seatbelt and jump out, run inside so fast that I shouldn't even worry about closing my door. I was to run inside and go directly to the person behind the counter and tell them to call 911 because a bad man was following us. We pulled in and she threw the car in park and I jumped out and did as I was told. She was only a few seconds behind, but she had to actually stop the car, park it, turn it off, whatever. She closed her door and mine for me, and just ran inside with me. The man came into the parking lot behind us, and when we were inside, he went through my sister's car. By the time the police arrived, he was gone. They never found him, and we never knew what provoked him or what his plan was. The only thing he took from the car was my sister's ID and the cash she had on her. Sorry that was so long, I think. But that's my story. I can still so vividly picture what was happening, but I don't remember being scared. I don't remember my sister ever showing that she was freaking out, although later at her mom she did lose her shit, sobbing her eyes out and yelling, understandably. I think the way she handled it really prevented it from being a really traumatic experience for me. It's still scary, but it's not something that haunts me.